Buffalo is the only city in the world that can boast having produced 2 presidents, inaugurated a 3rd, and killed a 4th, all of whom were lawyers. But I'm only going to talk about the 2 that we produced, and that would be Millard Fillmore and Grover Cleveland. And George, by the way, does send his regrets that he could not be here today. It is uncanny how much he looks like his grandfather. So it's really a loss for us to not have him with us today. I've given you in the materials the definitions of ethics that appeared when Millard Fillmore was practicing law and when Grover Cleveland was practicing law. I did not give you the current definition of ethics because I think that we all know what they are. But what's important in knowing, going back, because there was no professional code of responsibility when these gentlemen were practicing law, is the core values of the profession were the same then as they are now. These gentlemen had warts. They had very serious warts. In the case of Millard Fillmore, I wouldn't be here today if he had had his way, not so much because I'm a woman, but because my family are immigrants. In the case of Grover Cleveland, I wouldn't be here today because he really thought women shouldn't bother themselves with anything other than homemaking. So they certainly had warts, some of them very serious. But in their public lives, in their professional lives, in their private practice and public practice, I think that they personified and implemented what we today call the core values of our profession, i.e. the code of ethics. And I have tried to relate the things they did to the current code. And so we start with the preamble, which I think says it pretty clearly, what we're all expected to be able to do. And that is to represent our clients. As an officer of the legal system, we have special responsibilities for the quality of justice. We have a duty to uphold the legal process. We have a duty to demonstrate respect for the legal system. We have a duty to seek to improve the law and to promote access to the legal system and administration of justice, and to promote public understanding of confidence in the rules of law and the rule of law in this country as the preeminent code of living, and to promote confidence in the justice system. Now that's in the preamble, and I think it pretty much says it all. Presumably, all of our former lawyer presidents, of whom we've had 26 of the 44 presidents have been lawyers, presumably they have all been trained in some form of ethics, some form of the code, and some have exemplified the code better than others. Millard Fillmore assumed the presidency upon the death of Zachary Taylor. He did not serve a full term, and he did not run for election to a full term. His legal career spanned from the time of 1823 to 1847. He did indeed practice privately. He had a very lucrative practice, a busy practice. And I think it's a measure of the man that when he left the presidency and came back to Buffalo, he did not resume the practice of law because he believed it would be unfair to his opponents to have the former president of the United States standing at the bar in opposition. I think that's a measure of the integrity of the man. And that is, by the way, codified in today's code. We also are told that we should give competent representation to our clients. He declined a partnership early on in his career because he said he didn't know enough. So he went out to East Aurora to do small claims, what we today would call small claims, in order to learn the craft in order to learn how to be a good lawyer, in order to learn how to represent his clients properly, and worked his way up to admission to the Supreme Court of the state of New York. He acquired a reputation for honesty and integrity and clarity of thought and just generally good lawyering. He soon found himself elected to the Assembly of the state of New York. And there's some very interesting things that he did in the Assembly. When he had been a practicing lawyer, he had had a situation where a local Mason was kidnapped because, he was arrested because he had given out and published information about the secret rights of the Masons, and so other Masons didn't like that. He ultimately was kidnapped. He was charged with the crime, disappeared, never heard from again, and he was charged because he owed somebody $2. So he was charged with the $2 debt. That's how they got him. In the Assembly, remembering that, Millard Fillmore was outraged by that. So in the Assembly, he obtained and shepherded through legislation that got rid of debtor's prison, first state in the country to do that, got rid of a debtor's prison, and he offset that for creditors by having our first bankruptcy fraud law enacted. He then went to Congress, where his reputation went with him, and realized we're handling the people's money. We're fiduciaries here of our citizens. They're our clients, and we're handling their money. Nobody knows what's going on with their money. They would have this appropriation, the money would be paid, and nobody would know where it went. Nor did anybody know what authorized the appropriation. So he sat down and he went through every single statute of the state of New York to determine what the authority was for any appropriation of the people's money. Fiduciary. We have fiduciary accounts. I just went to a CLE program last week on handling lawyers' trust accounts. He came up with, he cataloged every single statute that provided for appropriation of money, and then when a department head asked for money, he made sure that legislation was in place that that department head had to say, where is Congress's authorization to give you the money, to give me the money, the department the money? I think that as lawyers, we certainly understand handling other people's money and the obligation to do it properly. However, when Taylor died and he found himself the President of these United States, he had the defining moment of his presidency, and it's the one which has cast him into the hell of former presidents. His dilemma, to sign or not to sign. Now, this is the background, and I hope you're going to hear some of it again today when we're talking about Lincoln. In 1848, which is when Taylor was nominated to be president, he was a war hero, but he also was a slave owner. He was a Whig. The Whig Party needed a person to offset the slave owner in order to get Northern votes. Millard Fillmore was on record as being opposed to slavery, and in fact, he had done pro bono work as a practicing lawyer in representing at least one fugitive slave, another one of our current rules of professional conduct. The Whig Party thought he would be a perfect offset for Zachary Taylor, the slave owner, and so he was nominated vice president. As vice president, he sat as president of the Senate, as you know. In the Senate at that time, things were heating up. The slave states were very, very angry, at the northern states. The northern states were very, very angry at the southern states. There were slave promoters, there were abolitionists, there were states' writers, and there were federalists, all going on, all fighting in Congress. In fact, one of the few times that it is historically recorded that one senator took a gun into the Senate chamber and shot another senator over this fight about extending slavery throughout the country. Now Taylor dies, Fillmore becomes president, and there's this discussion of what to do because California has petitioned for admission as a state. Henry Clay then served, and you all learned this in school. Henry Clay was then in the Senate as well, the great compromiser. And in 1820, the Missouri Compromise, you will remember, established the Mason-Dixon line. The Mason-Dixon line, some senators thought, should run all the way across the United States west to the Pacific coast. Northerners said, absolutely no way, we're not having another state come in as a slave state. It got hot and heavy, and Henry Clay now comes up with a compromise. And his compromise, which is known as the Compromise of 1850, provided 5 things. 1, California would come in as a free state. 2, the Texas boundaries would be firmed up. Texas was then its own republic and also wanted to be annexed, as you may recall, to the United States. But there was a fight over what the boundary would be. Land was given to New Mexico. Texas ceded land to New Mexico, and it was left to the people of New Mexico when and if it became a state, whether to be a free state or a slave state. It abolished the biggest slave trade anywhere in the world. And that slave trade was in Washington, D.C. Okay, the compromise abolished it, including providing that any slave who went into Washington for any reason at all was immediately made free. It established a territory for Utah, and here's the bad part of it. So far it sounds really terrific. The bad part of it was the Fugitive Slave Act. We had had a Fugitive Slave Act all the way back to the Northwest Purchase, when we purchased the Northwest Territory. The difference between this Fugitive Slave Act and those Fugitive Slave Acts was that this one, for the first time, imposed upon government officials in the North the obligation of returning any runaway slave to its owner. That was the difference. The North was industrial, the South was not. The South, however, had a pretty good militia in most of the states. The North did not. The North was not ready for war. And now is presented to President Millard Fillmore this compromise of 1850. What would you do? I suppose you don't really know what you would do. I don't know what I would do. And so I understand if you don't know what you would do. I don't know whether he was right or wrong. I know that he was genuine in his feeling that if he didn't sign it, the country would fall apart. And I believe that's true. I believe the country would fall apart. I think he felt if he didn't sign it and there was war, the North was not ready to go to war. And I believe that historically is true as well. Did that offset buying time for the North? Did getting rid of the slave trade altogether in Washington, biggest market in the world, and getting California to come in as a free state, Did that offset the Fugitive Slave Act? I don't know if it did or not. I don't know what I would do, but I think that there's enough room here to say, you can understand why he did sign it. And sign it he did. This, however, has defined his presidency, has defined him, and as I said, has condemned him to the lower reaches of presidents of the United States. Dr. Campbell at UB is writing a book on how the people view the presidents and how they rank the presidents, and he has determined that, in his book anyway, that the people rank Millard Fillmore 37. It's pretty low on the totem pole. In foreign affairs, his motto was that we have to treat other countries the same way as we would want them to treat us. And he eliminated things like flogging in the Navy. He took care of the land title problems in California. If any of you have ever been out there, you know that unlike us getting our titles through the Holland Land Company grants, they get their grants, their titles through the Queen and the King of Spain. But there were a lot of problems, and so he helped them work those problems out. And here's one that I think is very important. He devised a way and got legislation to allow citizens like us to sue the United States for redress. As I said, in foreign policy, his motto was that we should treat other countries the same as we expect to be treated ourselves. He negotiated with Portugal for the payment of claims that Americans had against that government. He suspended discriminatory duties imposed by Chile. He negotiated with Peru for the importation of guano. Guano was very important to the agricultural part of our country. It is a fertilizer. He held steadfast against interference in Cuba. And today, in the world of 2012, we're still dealing with Cuba. And successfully opened the doors to trade with Japan. And another thing that I think shows that he was truly a man of integrity, a man of honesty, a man of ethics. He was offered an honorary degree by Oxford University after his presidency. He turned it down and said, "I had not the advantage of a classical education, and no man should, in my judgment, accept a degree that he cannot read." Cleveland also turned down an honorary degree that Harvard offered him in 1866. Not with quite the same humor, but saying that he didn't feel that that he didn't have the kind of an education to accept that. He too did not, neither of these men went to law schools, as you know. They read law, which is what people did at that time. And so they didn't have a college education that they felt entitled them to these kinds of honors. Excuse me. And Cleveland is the only president that has served 2 terms, but non-consecutive terms. That question often comes up on Jeopardy, so if you're watching Jeopardy, you'll know the answer. He's the only one. And he served from 1885 to 1889, 1893 to 1897. And he is known for his motto, "A public office is a public trust." Again, I think reflecting the core values of our profession. He too was known for scrupulous honesty and integrity, and was known as being ugly honest, as a matter of fact. He too served in private practice and prepared his case. He's reputed to have prepared his case with great care, with great preparation, great care, and great persuasive talents. He did get, at that time, the largest damages verdict anywhere in the state of New York during his presidency. During his private practice years. He also rendered pro bono services in keeping with today's rules of conduct. This one to the Fenians. Any of you here know the episode in our history of the Fenians raid of Canada? Well, there were some 1,500 Irishmen who decided they were going to redress their grievances against England by invading Canada and doing it through Buffalo. And so they did. Needless to say, they didn't win, and they were all sent back to the United States, and they were all charged with crimes. And Cleveland represented some of them and arranged for representation for all of them, and he did it pro bono. Don't think he did it because they were Irishmen. I'm not sure. But he did render pro bono service. If you go up the Queen Elizabeth Way, you might notice along the road in various places between here and Hamilton little references to the Fenian raid. It's kind of a fun piece of American history that nobody knows about. And he too was concerned about dealing with the funds of the citizenry, his constituents. In the space of 3 years, he went from mayor of Buffalo, governor of New York, and to the presidency. That's all in the space of 3 years. However, before that, he had served as sheriff of Erie County. And as sheriff of Erie County, at a time when the brand new spanking state-of-the-art penitentiary had just opened down on 5th Street, he discovered that contracts were being let out to people who were not fulfilling the full requirements of the contract. And so he marched himself down to Pennsylvania and 5th Streets. And when deliveries were made of flour, he measured it himself. When deliveries were made of lumber, he measured it himself. And if there wasn't enough, if it didn't meet the contract requirements, which usually it didn't, he set the contracts aside. He also decided that he could not, in good conscience, ask a subordinate to do something that he would not do himself. And this led to his carrying out some of the executions in Erie County himself, that is, hanging. But in one of these, and this is the story of Jack Gaffney, at that time, sheriffs were able, under the law, to convene juries, grand juries, unlike today when they cannot do that. But at that time, they were allowed to convene a jury. And Jack Gaffney had been convicted of murdering a fellow card player in Buffalo's Canal District. Buffalo's Canal District was notorious. Not as lovely as it is now, but it was notorious for its crime and its vice. Anyway, Jack found himself in a card game, and he got mad, and he knifed the guy who was playing opposite him. Gaffney argued on his trial that he was insane. Cleveland was so troubled by that. Now, he was not the prosecutor, he was the sheriff. He was so troubled by that he he went to the governor and he got a stay of execution, and he then convened a jury. The jury was impaneled to determine one thing only: was this man insane? And they determined that he was not insane, and so he went to the gallows. But I think just the thought that he would be so troubled by this plea of insanity at a time when this wasn't even recognized in our law, that he would get a stay and he would convene a jury and he would have a hearing to make sure that the man was sane, I think really is very telling. As mayor, He said, "Public officials are trustees of the people." And this was translated by a journalist into what we all know as a public office is a public trust. When he took office, Buffalo was a pretty corrupt place. And if you look at Rule 1.1 and also 1.5, I think you'll find that his actions in dealing with some of the corruption in Buffalo were squarely embraced and executed under these rules. We were going to get a new sanitary system. We were also having our city cleaned. And the aldermen had awarded a $420,000 contract for cleaning the streets to George Talbot. George Talbot was very politically connected, and the amount of the contract was $100,000 more than the lowest bid of $50,000, and $50,000 more than Talbot's original estimate that he had submitted with his bid. So in voiding the contract, Cleveland said, "I regard it as the culmination of a most barefaced, imprudent, and shameless scheme to betray the interests of the people and to worse than squander the public money." With that, the Buffalo News thought, "Hey, this is a good guy to run for governor," and suggested that he do that. And he did, and he was elected. And in the course of that election campaign is when he was described as being an ugly, honest man of good courage, and undaunted courage was how he was described by Edward Epgar. He said, "I have only one thing to do, and that is to do it right. Let me rise or fall, I am going to work for the interests of the people in the state, regardless of party or anything else." And he did live up to that. He was scrupulously fair. He employed civil service system. He was very, very much in favor of merit appointments and not political appointments. And we needed to be fair with our citizens. We needed to be loyal and treat them legally, treat them fairly, scrupulously fair. And said that this could only be done by legislating without vindictiveness or prejudice and with a firm determination to deal justly and fairly with those from whom we exact obedience. Within another year, he was nominated for President of the United States. And one of the things that I think is most telling was on the floor of the convention when one of the young men, delegates, said, "We love him not just for his friends, but we love him more for who his enemies are." I think that is just such an amazing assessment of anybody, and I would be happy if anybody said that to me. However, again, we have a defining moment in his scandal. This is, again, is a personal scandal. As a young man, Cleveland liked to fish and hunt. And he had a party of young men with whom he did all of this. All of the men were married except him. And at that time, there were women followers of this group who went with them to their various hunting places and fishing places. And one of them was a Mrs. Halpin. One of the men who went hunting and fishing was Oscar Folsom. Oscar Folsom was Cleveland's law partner and ultimately would have been his father-in-law had he lived. But Mrs. Halpin was a widow and became pregnant, and in 1874 delivered a baby boy, and she named the baby boy Oscar Folsom. However, she named Grover Cleveland the father. Now, there are two views of Cleveland's role in all this. There are those who feel very strongly that he was the father, that this was evidenced by his providing support for the child and setting the mother up in business, and they castigate him for having the mother put into an asylum and the child let out for adoption. There is another view, and these are historians on both sides holding these views. There is another view that as the only bachelor in the crowd, and given his loyalty and integrity, that he took the fall for his law partner, Oscar Folsom, who was married and had a child of his own. I don't know which is true. I have been told that the descendants of the family of Mrs. Halpin, who live in Pennsylvania, may be seeking to have an exhumation of the body in order to get DNA. I don't know that they have to go that far, but I also don't think that the Grover Cleveland family is happy to cooperate with this particular endeavor. I don't know. George is not here, so I can't ask him in front of you. But that is, we may find out. And we may never find out, and we'll still be left with these two views, two competing views, that he was the father and he was not the father. In any event, that was the personal scandal. Getting back to his public life, however, his public life did not have a scandal. And his public life pretty much was personified by his State of the Union message of 1888, which is, I believe, attached to your materials. The equal and exact justice of which we boast as the underlying principle of our institutions should not be confined to the relations of our citizens to each other. The government itself is under bond to the American people that in the exercise of its functions and powers, it will deal with the body of our citizens in a manner scrupulously honest and fair and absolutely just. It has agreed that American citizenship shall be the only credential necessary to justify the claim of equality before the law, and that no condition in life shall give rise to discrimination in the treatment of the people by their government. He continued to veto any legislation which he thought was not in the best interest of the people, and indeed vetoed more measures than any president up until Franklin Roosevelt. Railroads had obtained vast lands in the country that they were not using. He, by executive order and court proceedings, restored 81 million acres of the western lands to the public domain, which is where he believed those lands belonged. And the high point of his first term, of course, was his marriage to Frances Folsom, Oscar's daughter. I don't think there were any ethical considerations there, so I'm not going to go into that, except to mention that this is the first time with Frances Folsom that the media exploitation of public images comes into the American conversation and into the American discussion, because they were wild for Frances Folsom. But just as the Compromise of 1850 had been a defining event for Fillmore, now the imbroglio of Hawaii became a defining event for Grover Cleveland in his second term. In the 4 years between his terms, American missionaries and commercial interests in Hawaii, led by the Doles of pineapple juice fame, then sugar interests, led an insurrection and deposed the Queen of Hawaii. And the missionary, the American a mission officer to Hawaii, was in on all of this and had the American Navy ready to invade as soon as this deposition of the Queen occurred, and the Navy did, and they proclaimed a new republic in Hawaii and petitioned Congress for to annex it or for statehood of Hawaii or for annexation, one or the other. This then is what happened just before Cleveland took the oath of office for his second term. This legislation was pending in the Senate. He did not like what he thought had happened here. He appointed a special investigator to look into it. The investigation found, in fact, that this had been done illegally. He acted on that, and he withdrew the petition from the Senate. And in the message that went to the Senate, he said, "If national honesty is to be disregarded and a desire for territorial extension or dissatisfaction with a form of government not our own ought to regulate our conduct, I have entirely misapprehended the mission and character of our government and the behavior which the conscience of our people demands of their public servants." He went on to call the actions of the Americans illegal, indefensible, and, as I said, withdrew the petition from Congress. In his last message to Congress, he reminded us that the United States has a character to maintain as a nation which plainly dictates that right and not might should be the rule of conduct. Buffalo's presidents, as I said, had considerable warts. By today's standards, I think if we judge them by their times, that they come out okay. But I think certainly if we judge them by our code of ethics, by our current rules, the rules of professional responsibility, what our core values, if we judge them as lawyers in public service, executing and acting on and demonstrating and inherently personifying those rules, they come out way at the top of the game. And I thank you for your attention. If there's any questions, if I have some time. I really thought I would run out of time because I was covering two presidents and not one. But I'll be happy to answer any questions or enter into a discussion as to whether or not you would have signed the Compromise of 1850. Yes?
Well, with regards to Hawaii, I mean, ultimately, Hawaii did become a U.S. territory in the state, so what did he do further than just withdrawing the petition? Did he do anything else, I guess, to prevent America from taking?
Well, he did restore the Queen to her throne. And it operated that way for a long, long time, and it was much later that Hawaii became petitioned to be a state. But what's really good about it, and I didn't mention this, is that every year he is so revered in Hawaii that every year they send a delegation to Buffalo, and we all stand in front of the statue in front of City Hall. And it's really a very nice experience, and I think a great tribute for him. I really can't see way up there. Are there any other hands that are up? Okay, well, thank you again for your attention.